Welcome back to the Stephen A. Smith Show. Let's get to New York, where jury selection began today in a federal sex trafficking and racketeering trial of Sean Diddy Combs. Federal prosecutors allege Combs used his power and wealth to sexually abuse, coerce, and exploit alleged victims for decades. If convicted, Combs would be spending the rest of his life in federal prison. Defense attorneys for Combs contend that all of his sexual encounters were consensual and have described the music mogul as a swinger who invited third parties into his bedroom. Last week, federal prosecutors offered Combs a chance to plead guilty for a reduced sentence. He turned down that offer. Joining us now, obviously, to discuss the trial is Ellie Honig, legal analyst for CNN, who's been on this show many times, one of our favorites. What's up, Ellie? How are you, man? How's everything?
Stephen, this is going to be a fascinating trial. This is the courthouse I used to practice in, so I can bring you inside the huddle on this one.
Well, I can't wait for you to do that. First things first, him turning down a plea deal for a lesser charge, is that something to be expected? Should that be considered a surprise? What do you make of that?
You know, it's an interesting little bit of last-minute gamesmanship here. It's not that uncommon for prosecutors to make an offer on the eve of trial. Now, the big question is, what were they offering, right? It's one thing if they were offering him 12 years. It's another thing if they were offering him 3 years or something like that. The fact that he said no, I guess it depends, again, on what the offer is, but he's dug in. Look, he appears to believe he's got a shot at winning this trial. Otherwise, he would have taken that plea, because the downside here, if he loses this trial, Stephen, he's going to get 15 years minimum. And as you said before, up to life. So Sean Combs and his lawyer must have sat down and said, look, there's a chance to get out of this for less, but they're comfortable rolling the dice. Those are very high consequence dice to roll, though.
Let's get to the jury selection, Ellie, which obviously started today. How long should we expect this process to take place?
So this is federal court. Federal jury selection is way quicker than state jury selection, right? We've seen state cases drag on for weeks and weeks and weeks. I have had juries selected in multiple murder cases in 2 days or so. Now, we have the complication in this case that everybody knows the defendant. Everyone who comes in there as a prospective juror will have at least heard something about Sean Combs, about Diddy. So that takes longer to wade through. I am certain we will have a jury by the end of the week. If I had to guess, I would say we'll have one by Wednesday. Federal court moves pretty quick when it comes to jury selection.
Given the charges federal prosecutors levied against Diddy, what type of jury should his defense team want to see, actually?
So this is where the gamesmanship comes in, Stephen. I'll never forget something that when I was a young prosecutor, a veteran defense lawyer who'd been practicing 40, 50 years said to me something like, jury selection isn't just a big deal, it's the whole ballgame. I mean, these are the people who decide the case. Now, let's think about this from the defense side. Like you said, you're Sean Combs, you're Sean Combs' lawyer. What are you worried about here? To me, it's pretty obvious. You want to avoid anyone who A, knows about this case, mostly everyone does, and B, just has their mind made up, has already come to some sort of judgment. There will be many, many questions asked of the jurors, the potential jurors. Have you heard about this case?
Right.
Have you formed any opinions? Could you still consider the evidence fairly? But look, the fact of the matter is this case has gotten an enormous amount of publicity. Sean Combs, since the indictment came down, has been the subject of all sorts of criticism, of jokes in the media. And I would be looking out for people who already had their minds made up against him and could not come in there and judge the case fairly and impartially. But the catch, though, Stephen, is a lot of people will say, oh, yeah, I could be fair and impartial. I could put aside everything I've heard. But this is where your gut instinct comes in as a lawyer. I tried a case against John Gotti Jr., right? Everyone had heard of the guy.
Okay.
A lot of jurors said, oh, I could be fair. But then it gets into that gut. Like, do I believe him? Am I sensing something weird that I don't think this person could be impartial? So defense is looking for people who've already convicted the guy.
But defense is also looking for people who know little to nothing about the case. I would imagine.
Yeah.
How plausible is that, in considering how high profile he is, that people don't have foregone conclusions because they're completely oblivious to what's going on?
Right. So you'd be amazed the types of answers you get from these potential jurors who sometimes have barely heard of things. I think everyone's going to have to say they've heard of the guy. I imagine 90% of the people will know, well, I know he was in some trouble, but I actually think you're right. I don't think that many people are going to say, well, I know he's charged with racketeering and sex trafficking and all that. I think they're going to just basically come down to, well, I know he got arrested. I know he's in trouble. I know it has something to do with sex and coercion and that kind of thing. So that's going to be a key question. How much do you know about this case? How much do you know about the charges? Have you read the indictment? Have you seen this story covered on CNN, on Stephen A's show. And you're just, it's a guessing game, right? It really does come down to your instinct. But yeah, if I'm the defense, I would want someone who knows less about the case. But on the other hand, if you get someone who's like, I've never heard of this guy, I've never heard of the case, then you start wondering, like, is there something off about this juror? And maybe I don't want that.
What about the defense team from this perspective? They've already put out, they've described the music mogul as a swinger who invited third parties into his bedroom. I'm like, is that a detail that you wanted to just let out as a defense team? I don't know what to make of that. What say you?
Third parties and fourth parties and fifth parties and sixth parties, apparently. But that is going to
Yeah.
be the defense. And look, I know it's maybe not the greatest PR move in the world, but it's a viable defense. And I think this will be the core of the defense. It'll boil down to maybe he's a freak, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, but there's no federal crime of being a freak. There's no federal crime of having these sort of aggressive, unusual sexual appetites. But going hand in hand with that, that's not going to be enough on its own, because you're going to have victims and witnesses testifying. You say, he coerced me, he threatened me, he assaulted me. And so they're going to have to combine that, maybe he's a swinger, but that's not a crime, with an attack on the victims in the courtroom. They're going to have to suggest that these victims, these witnesses, have bad motives. They're looking for a payday. They made up stories about him. It became a pile on, and they all sort of picked up on each other's stories. And that's a common defense you see in these sort of multi-victim, multi-witness cases. So I think that's exactly what the defense is going to be.
Since the last time you were on here weeks ago, has there been anything additional as it pertains to information or findings that have transpired over the last few weeks that you find potentially alarming or potentially beneficial to the Diddy case itself?
Yeah, I've actually been surprised the other way, Stephen, which is I thought there would be more victims that are charged in the indictment. I thought there would be more expanded charges. Now, prosecutors have tweaked this indictment up a little bit. They now reference victim one and victim two in the indictment. Apparently, there's going to be a third victim as well. But given the number of civil suits, the dozens of civil suits, I thought that at some point the prosecution would either be A, adding more and more victims than they did, and B, adding more and more defendants. This is a very unusual case in that the charge is racketeering, which means in this case, they're charging Sean Combs with being at the head, running a criminal enterprise, yet he's the only defendant. Now, you can do that. R. Kelly is another example of a guy who was a one-man racketeering enterprise. But look, I used to charge racketeering cases. I used to teach the course on racketeering within DOJ. My racketeering cases were mob cases. There's 25 guys, 28 guys, 15 guys. So it's unusual, and I think a bit surprising to me that the original indictment has more or less remained intact. I would have expected, I think I said to you, Stephen A., back at the time, I thought that there was going to be bigger expansions of this indictment than there were.
And because there aren't, is that an argument the defense makes in his favor? Where are the other defendants? How come he's the only guy that's really being prosecuted here? Why is it that you haven't been able to find anybody else since you're accusing him of racketeering?
Oh, you bet. They're going to make some variation of that argument. They're going to go, oh my goodness, folks, a racketeering enterprise. There must be a lot of people involved. Well, folks, guess what? They say he's the whole thing. How about all these other guys? How about these bodyguards? How about these handlers? How about these enablers? Now, some of them will testify. Some of them have been given deals. They've been given immunity, or they've been given non-prosecution agreements. So some of these people are going to get on the stand and say, yes, I was part of this. Yes, I helped him out. But in exchange for my testimony, I've been given a free pass. Now, you know what the counter to that is going to be. They got a sweet deal because they're just telling prosecutors whatever prosecutors want to hear. But it's not uncommon. I mean, I made more cooperation deals than I could even remember. So yeah, that's absolutely going to be a dynamic at this trial. He's the only one. They say this is a one-man show. You shouldn't believe that, members of the jury.
What about the video, Cassie Ventura, his ex-girlfriend, where he ran down the hallway half naked and dragged her, threw her to the ground, kicked her, and all of that stuff? We saw that video. First of all, we don't know. I'd like to know whether you believe that's going to be admissible in this court case, number one. And number two, the fact that she's agreed to testify against him, according to the reports. How damning do you believe there is the potential for that to be?
I think that video is the prosecution's single most important and most powerful piece of evidence. It will come in, by the way. That was the subject of a pretrial ruling. The judge said, yes, you may play the video. Now, the question is going to be, what's the relevance? What's the context around it? It appears the prosecutors are going to argue this was part of him threatening, forcing, coercing, abusing this woman as part of his effort to traffic her across state lines for sexual purposes. Apparently, the defense is going to be, no, this had nothing to do with the sex trafficking ring or coercion. This was a fight they were having over infidelity. And, I think Cassandra will be the most important witness for the prosecution. But the attack on her is going to be, she's a liar. She's telling them what they want to hear. She's looking to raise her own profile. She's got a bad financial incentive. And so, look, so much of this just comes down to the jurors are going to be sitting feet away from her. I mean, I've been in these courtrooms. They're going to be 4 feet away from her. And so much of it is just going to come down to how they assess her demeanor. What does she look like? How does she deliver her answers? Is she credible? From what I've seen of her in public, she seems quite credible to me. But people don't always play the same on the witness stand as they do in front of a camera.
What about the documentaries and stuff like that that have been put out about him and some of the allegations against him, and people essentially co-signing on what he's being accused of because they're highlighting his behavior what it was throughout these years? How much of an impact, if any at all, do you expect that to have?
So prosecutors cannot obviously just play the documentaries or pieces of the documentaries for the jurors, right? That would be inadmissible. However, if there's a witness on the stand who has previously spoken in one of these documentaries, and there will be many of those, everything they've said previously can be used to cross-examine them, to impeach them, as we say. So if a witness gets on the stand and says something a little different than what he or she said in a documentary, or leaves out a detail or adds a detail that they didn't say in the documentary, then that's absolutely fair game for cross-examination. And I assume in this case, if the prosecutors are any good at their jobs, and I'm sure they are, it's my former office, they have not just whatever the documentaries are, but the raw footage that came before it. Because a lot of times, you'll do a 2-hour interview and it'll end up being 12 minutes on the documentary. So I assure you both sides have watched that footage very carefully. And it's all in play, just the same if it was prior testimony, to a police officer in front of a grand jury. It can be used.
You've raved about your former place of occupation, Southern District of New York, and what it brings to the table in terms of its high conviction rate, et cetera, et cetera. You still feeling as confident in their case, considering their reputation and what they bring to the table? You still feeling as confident with the whole this whole Diddy matter against them?
That's a great question. So I of course, look, I came up through this office. I have a reverence for it, but I certainly do not think the SDNY is infallible. They've made a lot of missteps, including most recently, I think, throwing out the Eric Adams case, which I know a lot of the people there pushed back and disagreed with, but that came from up above. No, look, I think the case is a sound case looking at the indictment. I think the hype around it, and maybe the SDNY helped promote this hype, got a little beyond what actually ended up happening. But look, the odds are stacked against any criminal defendant in that courthouse. You'll see that conviction rates are 98%. Throw those out because that includes guilty pleas, which almost every case pleads guilty.
Okay.
There are no reliable data on how many trials result in conviction. But in my experience and just following that courthouse, 70, 80% or so of all trials result in conviction. I don't think Sean Combs is going to cut a sympathetic figure here for the jury. I think they're going to hear some horrible things about him. I think the witnesses are going to present some devastating testimony. I think that video that we talked about of the assault is really, really damaging evidence. So I would put it, if I had to make a pick here, I would say 75, 80% that he gets convicted.
Last question. Is he better off or worse off now than he was when he was first arrested as it pertains to this case and how he's looking?
Well, I think he's slightly better off in that it hasn't been this explosion in the number of witnesses. But look, it could get a lot worse. I mean, he was given that plea offer. Again, we don't know what it was, but he was given a chance to sort of hedge his bets and mitigate his bottom line loss here. And he chose not to do it. And the way these trials work, it's a flip of a coin. It's yes or no. The jury can't come down and say, well, we want to kind of convict him, but if some, they can split the verdict. I guess I should say that. They can convict him on some counts, but not others. But man, if he gets convicted on anything in this case, he's looking at double digits plus behind bars. So he's taking, look, it's a huge gamble. It's terrifying for anybody to be in that position. I've seen a lot of people go through it. The odds are against him. He has a very good defense team behind him. So anything can happen, but his life is on the line here.
Forgive me, I got one more question I just thought about. If your case is that strong, if you're the Southern District of New York and your case is that strong, why offer him a plea?
So it could be that they don't think it could be that they're worried about some aspect of their case. It could be they're worried about one of the witnesses or the victims. It also could be, look, the reason you offer a plea deal when you have a strong case, especially on the eve of trial, is A, you might be worried about some aspect of your case, or B, you're just trying to, again, cap your risks. You lock in a conviction, you move on to sentencing. And let's keep in mind, there's always a risk, Stephen A., of what we call jury nullification, which means when the jury or a single juror just says, I don't really care what the evidence is, I'm going to vote not guilty. And all you need is one. If you're the defense, right? You need all 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt to convict. So you get one person on that panel who says, I don't know, I don't believe some of these victims, or I feel bad for Sean Combs. I feel like he's been railroaded. Racial issues could come into play here. You have a black man sitting at the defense table. So a celebrity, a universally known guy. So my fear going into this as the prosecutors would not so much be of an acquittal. I don't think you're going to get 12-0 not guilty, but you never know. In a high profile cases hang. And then that's a win, essentially, for the defense. You can always retry a hung jury, but it's a nightmare for prosecutors. So it may have been, they said, look, if we can lock in a conviction, get X as the penalty, avoid the time and expense of trial, and avoid the risk of a hung jury, maybe they calculated that would have been worth it.
This case not going to be televised or anything like that, right? I mean, cameras are not going to be allowed in the courtroom or anything, right? Is that correct?
Right. Federal courts are dinosaurs. They refuse to allow not only cameras, but even live audio feeds. Even the Supreme Court, by the way, gives us live audio feed now, but they are old-fashioned. Wow. I am on this soapbox, Stephen A. They need to let cameras in there. The Constitution says public trial. Why are we acting like it's 1840? Show it. We can all watch it. We should get to see it.
Elie Honig, senior legal analyst for CNN, one of the best in the business. It'll be much-watched television whenever you're on. I can promise you that. Thank you, Elie, man. I really appreciate it, man. Take care of yourself.
Thanks, Stephen A. I appreciate it. Talk to you soon.